Thank you. So I was just talking to Vince. I have given a version of this talk before at PyDiff, which is our local Cardiff Python meetup, in case you haven't heard of it. If you're ever free on the third Tuesday of any month, do come along. This is the first time I've given this talk sober, because the last time it was our work's Christmas do on the same day, and I'd spent all afternoon drinking, and then went to PyDiff and gave this talk. So it's going to be nice to be able to remember what I said. Before I get started about beer, I'm actually going to go on a little bit of a diversion. I was writing this talk on Thursday, and I gave it a bit of a run through and realized that it was a little bit short, didn't last quite long enough, and I tweeted about that fact. And one of the PhD students at the School of Computer Science came back with a solution. In typical computer science fashion, if you haven't got enough time, just extend your slide transitions. And I thought, okay, yeah, all right, but then that's going to be a little bit weird if we've got 6-second slide transitions and just moments of silence in the talk. So I tweeted an apology, and again, Joseph, excellent computational thinking mind, came back, why not add some music? Musical interludes on your slide transitions. Make them algorithmically generated with Python, and now we're hitting the themes of the conference, yeah? So I thought, yeah, sure. You write that for me by Sunday, right? I thought, jokingly. Of course, there's always somebody who has to add some input. Vince decided that wasn't enough of a challenge, but it should include dragons as well. And Joe came back and he'd done it by later that evening. I thought that was brilliant. Looked at what he'd done, and he's actually, the code's on GitHub, he's written a tool that will take some MIDI input, turn it into a CSV file, randomly mutate that CSV file, and turn it back into MIDI. And you can repeat this process over and over again, and eventually get further and further away from the source. So this is what he provided me with, enough MP3 files to fill 6-second transitions between every slide of my talk. And this is where it started, Puff the Magic Dragon. And it very quickly descends, actually, it mutates. It's weird. So I'm not going to include all 50 of them, because I thought that might be a bit strange. But I will drop a few in here and there. And I can't remember where I've put them, so they'll be a surprise to both you and me. So while I'm not lecturing, which is what I do full-time, I'm a lecturer at the university. I teach on what is, in my opinion, the best computational and data journalism MSc in the country. While I'm not doing that, I occasionally have been known to have a beer. 1 or 2, 3, 4, maybe more. I'm not very picky when it comes to beer. I pretty much will drink anything. So far I found one beer that I didn't drink. I actually tipped it away. I tend to prefer imperial stouts, porters, the dark, heavy end of things, but I'm not fussy. The other thing I really like is life logging. I like capturing bits of my data. So I've been wearing a health Fitband thing for several years. I like tracking my sleep and my steps, and I could tell you every single meal I had between 2011 and 2013, that kind of thing. It's a little bit obsessive. And the life logging and the beer is combined in Untappd, which, if you've never seen it, is a social network around beer that includes a sort of diary logging aspect. So when you're out in a bar having an interesting beer, you can open up Untappd, search for it, find it, check it in, log that you've had it. You can add a photo, you can add a rating, you can add a comment, you can tag your friends in. It's got all that kind of good Web 2.0 social network stuff. It's got a whole level of gamification. You can unlock badges by checking in more and more beers, which seems a little bit irresponsible to me, but I've got a lot of badges. So that's great. So I love that service. That's fantastic. So I can go around and log all the beers I'm drinking and keep track of what's good and what's bad and so on. And then my computer science head kicks in, and the research I do is very much around how people use computer systems and what computer systems can tell us about people and society. So I suddenly realized that what we've got here is a massive data source that tells us a lot about what people are drinking, right? So I want to get hold of that, because every single beer check-in is a unique record that links a person to a beer at a given place at a given time, right? So if we can get access to lots of that data, we can start to come up with, some idea of what people are drinking and how and where and when and so on. And it's really easy. APIs, Untappd's got a really fantastic API. We only need a few lines of Python to access it. We can get requests, obviously, for making requests. Get our API key from Untappd. Anyone can apply for one. You've just got to have an Untappd account. It's completely free. They've got this really nice endpoint on their API that you can send a request to and say, literally, give me all of the check-ins that are happening in this area. So we give it some parameters, our API access token and a latitude and longitude. And in case you didn't recognize 51.48 minus 3.17, that's sort of the center of Cardiff. So we can send off to Untappd and say, hey, give me all the check-ins that are happening in Cardiff right now. Do that, fire off the request, ask for the JSON data back, and we get a huge amount of information. This is just one check-in that you get back. We get a bunch of information about the check-in itself, how far away it was from the point you specified, when it was created, what rating they gave the beer, what comment they gave the beer. We get information about the user. We get a lot of information about the beer, its name, its ABV, its IBU. We get a description of it. We get its style. We even get the logo of the pump clip if the brewery's added it. We get a lot of information about the brewery for the beer as well, the name, the label, how we get in touch with them, those kind of things. And we get a lot of information about where it's been drunk, the venue. So we get what category the venue has, where it is, what name it is. We can link to its Foursquare venue place page as well. So we get a huge amount of information. That's just one check-in. And we can get lots and lots of these things returned back at any one time with just a few lines of Python. I didn't use Python. I did it all in JavaScript because I had a node server sitting there doing nothing. And I thought, well, let's use that. So similar kind of code. But yeah, I actually used JavaScript, so a little bit misleadingly. Haven't used any Python at all in the data collection. But we did use Python for all the data analysis. So the area we can collect data from is actually huge. The default radius on that API endpoint is about 25 miles. So if we say, give me all the check-ins that have happened around this point in central London, what we actually get is all of the check-ins that have happened in London, in Greater London. Right? So for most cities in the world, we can just slap a point down in the middle and we'll capture all the activity within that city. And so that's what we did. Took our server and started asking Untappd what beer is being checked in these cities. So originally we started off with about 40 cities. We picked a lot more in the US, a few more around the EU, did some analysis on it, published a paper on it, and then cut it back for a longer study. So this is the data that I'm going to be talking about today. New York, LA, Chicago, Seattle, Denver, Boston, and Portland, which were all cities that proved themselves to be quite active on Untappd in our initial study, and then London, Dublin, Barcelona, Paris, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen. Some picked because we expected them to be quite beery, and others picked just to get a sort of spread of European cities. And we captured data for a really long time. Started in August 2015, finished the beginning of this month, and the only reason we finished the beginning of this month was because the server I was collecting data on was an OpenShift version 2 server, which anybody who knows anything about OpenShift sees they've now moved to version 3, and I was too lazy to port the code, so when the server died at the beginning of October, so did the data collection. So that's the entirely scientific way in which we picked our beginning and end points. So we've got 781 days worth of data, which is a phenomenal amount. It's actually almost 21 million check-ins. So we've seen almost 21 million beers being drunk around the US and the EU. About 16 million in the US, about 5 million in the EU. Untappd actually recently just posted a blog that they just had their 500 millionth check-in. So we've got about 4%, essentially. We've seen about 4% of their data go through, which is kind of cool. In that data, we've got 900,000 users, thereabouts. We've got 400,000 beers, we've got 850,000 venues, and we've got 31,000 breweries. So this is a fair amount of data on the state of craft beer, if you have to give it a label, in the EU and the US. I've only tried about 1,000 of those beers, so I've got a few more to get through. But it's always good to have a target, right? Something to shoot for. Okay. Thanks, Joe. So we've got a huge amount of data, so the first thing we've got to do is go straight for pandas, right? Always got to go for pandas. We're doing data science, we've got a huge amount of data, but actually, everything I'm doing today is just basic Python, right? I've forgone pandas. I'm not going to talk about pandas at all. I'm just talking about basic Python. I'm going to present some graphics that were done with matplotlib and Seaborn and stuff, but other than that, it's all standard library stuff. So the first thing we want to know is how many check-ins have we got and how many users have we got? And obviously, it's really straightforward. We don't need a data frame for that. We can just go through all of our cities, go through all of our check-ins, and literally ask for the length of our lists and count up how many unique IDs we've got. So we do that, and this is how our check-ins are distributed. Chicago in the lead, almost 3.5 million check-ins, all the way down to Paris at the other end, where we've got maybe 250, 200,000 check-ins. So a lot of the European cities, not as much activity, but then Untappd's an American service. That's where most of their marketing's been, so we kind of expect that. London's not doing too bad, about halfway along the chart there, just after Portland, somewhere around 1.7 million check-ins. If we look at the number of unique users in each city, you can see the Portland bar drops significantly. Right? Portland, just next to London there, drops significantly. So they've got far fewer users in Portland, but they've drunk the same amount of beers. Right? So instantly we know something about Portland. Right? They like a beer there. Everywhere else is pretty much the same. Let's look at when they're drinking beer. We've got about 900,000 people. When are they actually drinking beer around the world? Again, this is pretty straightforward to do. With Python, we make a big array, 24 columns, 7 rows. We go through our data. Every time we see a beer at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, we add 1 to the 4 p.m. Wednesday box. We count how many times we see 4 p.m. Wednesday, and we can quickly figure out an average. What's the average number of beers drunk at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday? And we do that for all the hours and all the days. And we get something like this. This is actually the graph for New York, the times of drinking in New York, but because New York's such a huge amount of data, it's fairly representative of sort of the global average. And you can see the kind of pattern you'd expect. Not many people are drinking on Monday. It gets higher on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, gets to Friday. Lots of people are drinking. Saturday and Sunday, people are drinking all day long and going later into the night. It's kind of, you could have guessed this, right? We look at London and pay close attention to about the 12 p.m., 1 p.m. thing. In London, everybody goes out for a sneaky pint at lunchtime, right? Especially on a Friday, where they drink as much on a Friday lunchtime as they do on a Sunday lunchtime, despite it being a work day, right? I don't know what this says about the productivity of London on a Friday afternoon, but so there's a definite distinct change there. Everybody in New York, very sensible, waiting till after work to start drinking. Everyone in London just hitting it from midday onwards. We see Paris and it's completely different, right? We don't have that long weekday, weekend drinking all day. We have a slight peak at lunchtime at the weekend. We look at Amsterdam and it's completely different again. And Sundays are almost as big a day in Amsterdam as Saturdays for drinking in the afternoon, okay? So we can start to see these kind of cultural differences sneaking in. And again, the peak for nighttime drinking in Amsterdam is sort of 9 p.m. Paris, it's more like 8 p.m. London, it's more like 7 p.m., right? And this has all been adjusted for sort of, the time zones and stuff. So this is an actual shift that we're seeing, that more people are drinking later on the continent than they are in London, or people are remembering to check in later on the continent, and in London they've had a little bit too much and they're forgetting. So we can look at what beers they're drinking. Again, very straightforward, just go through all of our cities, go through all of our check-ins. Every time we see a beer ID, add 1, right? And we'll end up with a counter that's got the number of times each beer has been seen in all of our check-ins, and we can see what the most common is. So, assuming that our 13 cities are in any way representative of Europe and the US, which is a bit of a stretch, but assuming that they are, would anybody like to hazard a guess as to the most popular beer that we saw? No. Budweiser, no. Beck's, no. Guinness Draft. 90,000 check-ins in our data set. Does anybody want to guess the next one? Heineken, 61,000 check-ins. Then Lagunitas IPA, right? So we're seeing here that Untappd really is for something, the kind of craft beer market. Goose IPA. Revolution Brewing Anti-Hero IPA. This is not one I've had, but since I've seen that it's in the top 5, I'm going to have to search it out. And then we get Bud. First appearance of Bud Light at number 6. So that's globally, it's really big brands, right? Most people will have heard of at least 3 of those brands. I would think probably Lagunitas as well, if you know anything about beer. So that's kind of interesting. Look at the picture in the EU. Anybody want to hazard a guess? Anybody brave enough? Brains. I haven't actually looked at the stats on brains. I'm not going to say anything at the moment because I've already been tweeting enough about brains in the last couple of weeks. I don't think I'm allowed in my local pub anymore. Heineken. Heineken's top beer in the EU. Guinness then popular. Then we see the first appearance of a UK brewery, Brewdog Punk IPA, London Pale Ale, and Estrella. I mean, these are all artifacts of the cities that we're looking at, right? We're looking at Barcelona, so Estrella's going to go straight into the top 5. In the US, Lagunitas top, Goose IPA, that Anti-Hero IPA again, Guinness crops up again, and Bud Light. So it's kind of interesting picture of really big craft breweries who are now owned by other breweries or the global brands. But if we look at a local level, it's completely different. Looking at Copenhagen, unsurprisingly, the top 5 is dominated by Carlsberg. Right? 4 different varieties of Carlsberg and then something else. In Denver, it's different, completely different breweries. And the breweries that are popular in Denver are not the breweries that are popular in Seattle. Again, they're completely different. So we're seeing that globally, we've got this kind of big global brand thing going on. We've got Guinness and Heineken and the big players. But if you look at the local stuff, it's the smaller, it's the craft, it's the independents or semi-independent kind of breweries, which is really interesting to see. What strength are they drinking? If you've looked, or I know I went through those a little bit quickly, but you could see the ABVs, and there's a bit of a difference. If you aren't familiar with craft beer, the kind of beer that's very popular with people who are going to use Untappd tends to be a bit higher strength than the beer that certainly we're used to in the UK, where traditionally beer has been anywhere between 3 and 5% as a rule. So we can do the same thing again that we do with counting beers, except this time we just create a big list of all the ABVs, so the alcoholic percentage of the beers, and have a look. And what you can instantly see is that for both London and Dublin, it's much lower strength beer, right? This is why we can go and have a pint at lunchtime in London and then go back to work, right? Because it's only somewhere around about 4%, whereas if you go and do this in Amsterdam, chances are it's going to be north of 6%, and that's going to impair your Friday afternoon working. So London and Dublin very different, and then all the other cities slightly higher, and you really see that with the violin plot. You've got London and Dublin, these kind of short, fat violins, lower down on the ABV scale, and everything else is kind of stretched much higher, including in Amsterdam, is sort of peak at around 9% ABV, so there's some really popular beers around that area. This is actually truncated if I show you the whole thing. Somewhere in our data there is somebody claiming to have drunk a 91% ABV beer in New York. I would assume that they were called an ambulance shortly afterwards. Whether that's just, the problem with Untappd is quite a lot of the data is crowdsourced, so you can create a beer in Untappd and then check into it. So whether there is actually a 91% ABV beer in New York, I don't know. It would be something to have a look at. You see now why I didn't include all of them, right? This is getting a little bit freaky. What style of beer are they drinking? So this is, we've got beer styles, we can look at those and we can do exactly the same thing. Untappd's actually got a hierarchy of beer styles. It's incredibly complicated. So what we've done is we've created our own taxonomy and sort of put everything into smaller categories. So globally, this is what Untappd check-ins look like in all our cities. American ales, absolutely running away with it. Other ales then, lagers not getting much of a look in. Anything that isn't beer, again, not really featuring. And once again, New York is very similar to the overall picture. American ales most popular. London, American ales very popular, and English ales very popular, as you might expect. American lager is quite popular in London too. Paris, English ale's not faring so well. French ale's doing very well, but actually French ales do a little bit better in Amsterdam than in Paris. We also have a high number of German lager drinkers in Amsterdam. So this is kind of, again, showing that there's these very interesting regional cultural differences going on in that data set. And there's one other difference that I want to show you, which is in ratings. All of these check-ins have ratings attached to them. So we can quite quickly go through and see if there's any difference between our European cities and our American cities in terms of the ratings. And there is. The beers in American cities are getting rated higher than the beers in European cities, right? Whether this is because they are better or because Americans are more generous with their ratings, I don't know. But you can definitely see when you look at the distribution, American beers, American ratings are all shifted further to the right than the European beers are, right? So either American beer actually is better, all the people over there are more generous, and Europeans are a little bit meaner with their marks. So what has Python taught us about beer? Who? Well, we've got 900,000 Untappd users, 13 different cities. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, all those places. What are they drinking? Well, they're drinking higher strength stuff outside of UK and Ireland than we're drinking here. Big global brands dominate Guinness and Heineken and so on, but at a local level, we've got a lot more variety going on. There's a lot more interesting things in the data set. When? All the time. We're basically never not drinking, especially Friday lunchtime in London. And why? This is the one question we haven't been able to answer with the Python. But I do have a proposal for a follow-on experiment that involves me trying the other 413,000 beers in the data set to see if the answer lies in one of those bottles. I'm currently looking for funding if anybody's interested. Thanks to Joseph for doing this, spending his Thursday evening on this. It's much appreciated, and I would say go and check out Joseph, because if you've ever got a coding problem, it seems like you can just give it to him and he'll do it. Also, thanks to my co-authors, this was work that was done with a few other people, Matt Williams, Luca Rossi, and Gareth Tyson, who did some of the analysis that I presented there. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. I think we can all agree that was thoroughly entertaining. So we've got time for a couple of questions. There's first one here.
Hi there, thanks for the talk. It was very informative. I'm really interested to know, you showed Chicago as being very, very high up for beer drinkage. I would be very interested to know, did you check to see that that was mostly St. Patrick's Day?
No, so the seasonality of beer is something that we have thought about looking at. When I first gave this talk at PyDiff, we'd only been collecting data for about 3 months, I think, and the most popular beer was a pumpkin ale, because we've been collecting around this time of year, so we hadn't got the full sort of yearly cycle of beer drinking. But no, we do want to dig into that. We also want to see what effect big beer festivals have and stuff like that.
Thanks, that was entertaining. Do you plan on publishing the data set so I can query for the data myself for other cities or whatnot?
Well, so we don't have the data for any other cities because of the way the collection works. The code for collecting the data yourself, I think, is all up on my GitHub. So if you wanted to set up your own collector, you can. I'd be very worried about publishing the data simply because I would imagine Untappd would try and sue me the minute I did. So they are aware of the work, they know about the work because we've sent it to them and emailed them several times and said this is what we're doing and here's our email addresses and you can cut off our API access if you want, and they haven't, so we assume that they approve.
Thanks, Martin. Do you know of any other data set that might exist that you could use to check whether or not this data set is representative also of people that are not on Untappd?
Yeah, so there are other services, things like Beer Advocate is one popular beer rating service that people use. And we have thought about doing that, but again, whereas Untappd have got a lovely API, Beer Advocate don't, and it would be sort of, we'd be scraping essentially, and yeah, we're not really cool with it.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Thanks for the questions, and thank you, Martin.
Thank you.